The Liberal government tabled a long-awaited bill today on First Nations clean drinking water. Right now, there are nearly 40 active long-term drinking water advisories across Canada, 4 in First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, 6 in Manitoba, and 28 across First Nations communities in Ontario alone. Some First Nations leaders say they were not consulted on this legislation.
Government prepares legislation without us. It signals to our nations that the government is only interested in protecting themselves.
Minister of Indigenous Services Mandy Gull-Masty is here with us in studio. Welcome.
Roger.
The previous version of this water legislation explicitly recognized and affirmed that access to clean water is a human right for every individual on First Nations land. This version changes the language, this progressive realization over time. Why did your government weaken the language around this right?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I really appreciate that. You know, the tabling of this bill today is something that is really important. There are many communities out there waiting for it. There are many communities waiting for the tools that are attached to it. The progressive realization, I think in a first read, people's reaction is, oh, this is a weakening. First, I want to say very clearly that the human right is still part of the bill. The progressive realization means 3 things. That we are introducing minimum standards that never existed in First Nations communities before. We're closing the regulatory gap. We're actually also creating space for First Nations to work with not only federal, but provincial and territorial partners as well to ensure that protection of source water is outside of the boundaries. Transformative change in this space doesn't happen overnight. And I understand in my visits across the country and engaging with First Nations leaders, and even in my own nation, the variations of what water systems look like. So the progressive realizations means that we are acknowledging the pathway that all First Nations are making decisions that are individual for their own members. They are going to need the tools. The succession of how they proceed down that pathway is going to be unique to them. This is progressive.
But you say, you know, you've been to these communities, you understand the reality. Well, the Assembly of First Nations represents many of these communities. They are not satisfied with this and also see it as a weakening. So why do they not see this the same way as you do, if indeed this is about affirming a right? Because the language does sound weaker, Minister, than the previous attempt.
I can acknowledge that. You know, I think working with First Nations leaders, I'm going to reaffirm that they're going to bring forward their opinion. I have to do the work of closing that gap of the understanding in the decisions that I took for this bill. I depended on 6 years of consultation. I understood what the framing was around this bill at the time that it was presented. I'm also taking into consideration the context of the political landscape now. To me, creating the space for progressive realization, adding the component of having other levels of government participate in trilateral agreements, reaffirms the work, supports the work that First Nations are going to do. I'm trying to also ensure that I don't have jurisdictional overreach, that I am shielding First Nations from potential challenge for the work that they're going to do. I think that we're now in a space where, as an Indigenous minister, I understand the importance of everybody having a voice at the table, working together, collaborating, because the work in this bill, the funding that's attached to this bill, is a resource that many First Nations communities need.
You talked about the political landscape and the legal challenges. Is it the provinces that you believe that would challenge this? Like, where does the challenge come from?
I don't think it's just one place. You know, some provinces may ask themselves, is this really the work that we want to do and how we at the provincial level want to protect water? For me, I don't think that water stops at the provincial boundary, not the last time that I checked. You know, I want to be sure that water as it flows across the country is protected, that First Nations are part of that.
But are you really saying this is the best we can do? I mean, that's sort of what you're saying, that the bar was up here before, but now you've looked at the facts as they are, to perhaps borrow a phrase from the Prime Minister, and sorry, First Nations, this is the best we can do.
I mean, sitting in my chair as a minister, I've observed a Prime Minister who's taken the decision to add almost $7 billion of funding in the first year of his mandate alone. That's more than half of what has been invested since 2015. I see a Prime Minister that gave a minister a mandate to read, understand the file, take the decisions that I need to take. I see a Prime Minister that has prioritized this as part of his platform, moving it forward, has agreed with some of the recommendations that I've made. I see a Prime Minister who's mandated a minister to do this work, present what I think is a good starting point. I acknowledge that. I didn't think I would come forward and get, 100% right off the bat. I am a new minister, but I know that the next step is really the engagement process. We go through parliamentary. I'm going to be engaging with communities over the summer. I'm not closed to what I'm hearing. I understand that there are many different voices around the table. I'm trying to find the balance in the spectrum.
You talk about the money that's involved in this, the $4.6 billion over 5 years. Will that be enough to get rid of all the boil water advisories we're currently facing?
There's presently 36 boil water advisories for different reasons. In some communities, there's a boil water advisory issued because there's no operator and they have to rehire. In some communities, it's because they're doing a capital project and they've disturbed the earth around piping. There's different reasons. I think the importance is that we've committed to this. We've committed additional governments to this. Is this going to be enough? In 5 years, I'm going to reassess, reanalyze if I'm still in this seat. Be sure that whatever tools I've created now are going to meet that moment in 5 years.
Well, the Conservatives are explicitly saying the fact that there is no commitment on timeline is a problem. Why not set a timeline? I mean, the Trudeau government did. They missed it, obviously. Is it that you believe that this is going to be a perpetual problem in this country?
The commitment that the former Prime Minister made, he did achieve 95% of the long-term boil water advisories being lifted. There was also 334 short-term that did not become long-term boil water advisories. All due respect to the opposition, I don't think that they're here to support the position that I'm in terms of what a deadline looks like. I'm here to say that when I work for First Nations communities, I'm working according to their deadline, not parliamentary deadline.
But I think we can all understand that you set a goal that gives you a level to reach, and if you won't set the goal, perhaps it suggests that you don't think you can quite get there. So your criticism of the Conservatives, sure, but if you're praising what Justin Trudeau did, why not set your own deadline to tell Canadians and First Nations that this is a problem you believe you can get solved?
Well, I think what I want to be clear on is my commitment to work with communities in the space that they're in. Do I predetermine how efficient they're going to be? Do I predetermine what I think is the best timeline for them? No, I don't. I know that communities are going to come forward with different scenarios, different issues as part of their project management, different realities. They're not all starting in the same place. In some places, there's a very high level of trauma. I'm going to be respectful in that space. There's some places where communities are extremely high capacity. They have less work to do. I think what's important is that in that spectrum, we are creating space to find the solution that communities need for themselves and need for their members.
Okay, Minister, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Sydney Woodhouse Nepinak is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and she joins me now. Welcome, National Chief.
Thank you.
You have said that this legislation needs to be improved. I know there are a number of issues that you're concerned about. What is the number one? What's at the top of your list?
Well, I think number one is that the right to clean water was not included in this bill, and certainly weak source water protection. I mean, there's some good things out of this too. I mean, at the same time, limited definition of what First Nations lands is in this water legislation. Provincial veto remains, status quo for at-risk communities. I think some of the good at this, though, is there's insurance protection. There's First Nations Clean Water Commission, which we welcome. We do also welcome the $4.6 billion because it's badly needed on many communities across the country. And, references to FPIC and UNDA, and of course, First Nations having the ability to pass their own water laws. So
I want to dig into this because you've laid out a lot of things there. The fact that the last Liberal government wanted to affirm clean water as a right, that was written in the legislation in 2003 that, of course, never made it into law. This new legislation talks about progressive realization of that right. I'm making the quotation marks because it's the language that's used in the legislation. Help us understand why that difference matters.
Well, it does matter because I think the original bill, I'll call it the original bill prior to this one, was written. And I remember taking off a winter break, like everybody was having Christmas, and, Chief Linda DeBossegay and, Phil Fontaine, myself, people in the government like Joanne Wilkinson, everybody was pulling and pushing back and forth to get that written well. It was tough negotiations, I think, on both sides at that time. And, and I know that pieces of that bill ended up in this new bill.
But I really want to get to the why. I think for folks at home who haven't thought about this, what does it change potentially in the life of a First Nations person or a First Nations community if it is a right versus the progressive realization of a right, which the government says is just acknowledging the fact that different communities are in different places?
Well, absolutely, it should be a right for First Nations. At the same time, I can't speak for the government, and I hope that that they'll be here at the table and listen to First Nations. For example, by not including the right to clean water in this bill, this government is continuing that troubling shift away from, the explicit recognition of First Nations rights to, towards more provincial priorities. And, we have to work on amendments to make sure that the honor of the Crown is implemented. I mean, there was, First Nations communities calling today, and many of them that have, went to the courts on this issue and that are still in court. So is this bill going to, live up to that, those court issues and those court orders?
Well, in fact, the minister suggested, I think, that this language is different because she wanted to avoid court battles. She wanted something that would stand the test of time. What do you say to that logic?
Well, I think first and foremost, I hope that this government in committee and in Parliament committee, and then of course in the Senate, that they make sure that there's enough time to hear from First Nations on this bill, something that affects us each and every day. We also want to invite committee members to come to our First Nations communities to see exactly how this impacts our lives every single day. And to be able to have that debate right now about whether it's a human right or not is just, it shouldn't even be. We're at 2026. Let's move beyond that. Let's make sure that we put the amendments in this bill to make it stronger. We are stronger when we work together. And, and that makes making sure that the parliamentary process is fair and timely.
You talked about the money involved, $4.6 billion over 5 years attached to this. The federal government is touting this as the largest single commitment ever made to First Nations water. I mean, how far do you think that amount of money will go towards eliminating these boil water advisories?
Well, it's $900 million a year, right? Mm-hmm. Rough give or take. And, we want to make sure that that's moving out right away to make sure that it's making a difference in the lives of First Nations people, because we do welcome it. We need infrastructure built. And we desperately need clean drinking water for our kids. So we welcome that in that way. But at the same time, let's make sure that the legislation is written more strongly, and by, focusing on the amendments that First Nations will bring forward.
Do you believe it could be enough money to resolve all of the current cases where there are communities that do not have adequate drinking water?
The Assembly of First Nations has, we worked with the Conference Board of Canada, and look, for every dollar you put into a First Nation, we get $1.67 back. So it puts us at the front line. If there's any, it trumps, anything to do with the U.S. It helps bring that up for all Canadians. Anytime you put money into First Nations, it's an investment into our country. And, but it is 20% of what is needed at this time, because the gaps are so huge. And, a lot of First Nations, the things that towns and cities would never have to deal with, we have to deal with. Like, a lot of Canadians kind of, and I explain it sometimes, and I say, imagine a municipality having something broken on their water truck, or something within their water system, having to go and get a ministerial loan guarantee from, the federal government. They don't have to do that, and a lot of Canadians are like, they're taken aback by that. And they say, really? Like, you have to, every aspect of our lives is kind of through Ottawa.
I want to ask you about just one more thing before I let you go. It's not very long ago, I think a couple of weeks now, that you had an audience with the King. And coming out of that meeting, you talked about having raised Alberta separatism with him. And the language that you used at that time suggested that the King was on your side, your concerns about Alberta separatism. Can you tell us what you understand the King's position to be about Alberta separatism?
Look, I think that the British family, I think even prior to the signing of treaties, there was peace and friendship treaties. They celebrated those during that time, just a day after getting back from the King's visit. Certainly the importance of First Nations in this country and the relationship that we have with the British Crown is important to the creation of this country. First Nations it's traditional First Nations territory from coast to coast. And, our relationship with, with the King is, we left on a good way. And we did, of course, express our concerns about the talk of separatists and trying to pull apart this beautiful country that we share together. And that, I think that Steerly stated that, we're in unison on that, right? Like that.
I mean, typically, the King or Queen does not take a political position publicly. But so I'm just trying to understand here. Do you feel, though, that he does have a stand? You're trying to say he does have a particular stand here, and it's on the side of First Nations?
I'm saying that I'm glad for the meeting that we had with him. I think if he thought that it was going to be a pushback or a push down, I'm sure sometimes the King, like when he came to Canada here and made sure and told Canada, work on deeds rather than words. I think that he was particularly saying that as well about First Nations, start working on deeds rather than words. And so, today was a good first step as a hockey mom on this water legislation, going back to that. We're in the first period, we scored a goal, but we can't celebrate that until the hockey game is done.
Okay. National Chief, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.